Hi everyone. Uh, so finally, since morning we discussed about PWA. So many talk already had about PWA. Now on the screen, all the big faces you can see all are like Magento Masters, PWA expertise. So I am going to hand over this stage to self-introduce, please. Over to you guys.
Hello, everybody. Thanks a lot for being here today. My name is Miguel. I've been working for Nexus for the last 5 years. I'm a PWA enthusiast, and I wanted to do this panel because there's a lot to say about PWA, and then there's a lot of experts out there. So it's really interesting to try to understand the alternatives and how this plays out with your store. Jisse, you want to go?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Jisse Reitsma from the Netherlands. And I've been doing actually trainings for the last couple of years for most of my time, dealing with Magento development, front-end development, but also PWA with React and Vue. And just like Miguel, I've been a Magento master for some time, but actually I'm promoting another label, which is Magento Bastard. So everyone is able to become a Magento Bastard. You don't need to have a voting for that. You just stand up and you say, I'm a bastard, and then it's good to go. But yeah, that's me. Arun.
Thanks, Jisse. So hi everyone, I'm Arun. I'm founder and CEO of ServerGuy and Breeze.io. We do managed hosting for enterprises, and under Breeze we have a platform for running managed WordPress and Magento. And I, like Miguel, I'm a PWA enthusiast, and we've been figuring out how best to support the entire PWA ecosystem, and look forward to our discussions today.
All right, how about we start by talking about the different PWA alternatives that are out there for Magento. I know Eric already talked about PWA Studio, but that's not the only one alternative out there. I've seen Candy PWA, I've seen Xenia, I've seen the storefront. There are a couple of custom built PWA alternatives. So what's your experience about all that? For me, it's been quite a ride because we keep seeing people come to Nexus and trying to use different builds, but there are a bunch we can support, the ones that are based in GraphQL. But then when you add a different middleware, an extra layer of software, that's kind of complex. So there are different alternatives and different ways to do this.
Yeah, so I think like we're at the breaking point within the Magento community where maybe the Adobe roadmap is just pointing towards more enterprise readiness, while there's actually plenty of shop owners and therefore also developers that are eager to look for another alternative. So personally, I'm always eager to see all of those different options out there: Vue Storefront, PWA Studio, and I'm tending more and more to speak about not only PWA as kind of like a revolution, but also alternative front ends. I'm already giving this shout out, like earlier today, there was also a talk by Vijay Golani and Willem Wichman about HUFA, and we just learned how to pronounce that, which is basically not the PWA technology, but it's much more about an alternative to the knockout/require.js front end. And all of that is in motion. So yeah, personally, my first comment there would be that I love the variety, that I love the fact that there's more and more choices coming up, so that everyone is able to pick its own choice what they prefer.
Absolutely, yeah, and yeah, let's be serious here. Basically, the current Magento 2 frontend, it's extremely hard to develop. It's extremely hard to extend. And the second you come across the checkout, you're like, I don't want to use this platform anymore. So it's really great to see more and more front-end alternatives, and it doesn't have to be PWA. While this panel is about that, it's really important to understand there are different options, different approaches, and while using GraphQL and different APIs, it's way simpler to integrate a custom front-end, a different storefront, instead of just going with UI components, which are frankly really hard to use.
Yeah. So one thing I'll add there is you also have to understand what technology you're already comfortable with. So if somebody is already thorough with React, they enjoy working with React, then that would be a very important decision. And same goes with Vue. And it is also interesting to see the adoption. So built with is typically a good source. So there I can right now see that Magento PW is only on active on 187 websites, 184, and Scandy is on 109. While View Storefront is on around 2000 websites. So that can be an introduction to where you want to place your bets on.
Yeah, but I think like what you say is important. So many times I've been asked, a Magento developer is knowing the traditional old front end, and then they hear about all of this new PWA stuff. And the question then is like, what option to go for? But I'm never able to answer that question directly, because if there's a React developer that tends to love either Deity or PWA Studio. If you're a Vue developer, then you love Vue Storefront. If you hate both React and both Vue, then actually you're going to like maybe Hufa in a better way. So it's basically also depending upon who you are and what kind of choices you want to make as an agency. Hey, and in between, actually, the panel is extended upon by Vijay. So hi Vijay, do you still want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Myself, Vijay Golani, junior developer at Magento and an organizer of Meet Magento India. As well as if we are just talking about PWA, then I work with Magento, Magento U team, and recently we have prepared one PWA Studio course also. I think that is going to launch soon. And if I just heard the discussion, so I would like to say one more thing. Like it's again one more thing we need to focus is the timeline and budget also. There are some ready-made things available. Like if it is a timeline is limited, then we need to go with that ready-made option. And if timeline is unlimited and they just wanted to build from scratch with everything there in their hand, then maybe we can just use the another options also. So that can be also one option.
Yeah. Yeah, and another thing maybe to note is also the terminology is often wrong as well. Just a couple of days ago, there was this discussion between a couple of PWA Studio people and some other people saying, well, that as soon as you make a comparison between a new front end like Hufa and Magento PWA Studio, it's like comparing apples and pears. Because PWA itself is just an acronym, an abbreviation for Progressive Web App, meaning actually that they're just a bunch of features that just make that website. But what kind of features are needed? And that's kind of like the difficulty always with that discussion. But I think in general, if we talk about PWA, I think it's just that we talk about Vue and React like technology, while theoretically, or if you put the practice to the word and you are precise about what PWA actually refers to, it's a different discussion. You can also just turn Luma into a PWA, but just adding a manifest.json file in there, and then you're done. And that only takes 1 minute work. So, yeah.
And maybe like one more thing, to use the PWA is for the growing countries and in a rural area where there is still not a very good internet speed. So like that is also one thing we should consider. And there are right now, small merchants also trying to make their online store. So for them also, they need to go to the small cities or even small villages also to sell the online. And over there, maybe PWA can be the good approach to do the offline shopping as well as like in a lower internet speed.
So
absolutely, yeah. You go, Arun.
So one thing I'll add is that you need not do PWA for your entire user experience at times. So you can sort of try and experiment. So whether do just a PWA for just a single product and see how it is actually impacting your entire checkout flow, your conversion, and then probably do the entire adoption. So.
Yeah, we've seen that being done in a couple of different stores. It's really interesting to see because you get a front end for like everything, and then you have this single page for PWA for a product, and it's really interesting. I would say that's definitely a way to go. Sorry, Jisse.
Well, I still wanted to comment upon what Vijay mentioned about offline shopping. So I think always when I come up with a comparison of all of the features that involve PWA, well, then you can talk about well, having an add to dashboard feature, or you can talk about push notifications. But I think the reality is also still that the traditional front ends also allow for those features. But specifically React and Vue, they shape up the opportunity of offline shopping. And that sounds always pretty cool, but I think it's also part of a larger experiment where we're trying to push the web into a new direction. And as Vijay mentioned, there's rural areas in specific countries in specific parts of the world that don't have internet. For example, the UK. I still remember that story of an area in the UK actually being absent of internet. So there's no 3G, 4G, there's nothing. But basically that's pointing towards that theoretically offline shopping could be a good solution there. But offline shopping is not one thing. So you can turn the homepage into an offline homepage, but what if you just visit the homepage and you have a catalog of 1 million products? Are you then going to download that 1 million products down to the homepage visit already? Or are you not going to do that, and are you only able to visit those pages that are there? Another question is, if you're offline, can you place an order? Can you pay offline? And etc. So I think it's much more challenging. And therefore the difficulty is also like, do you need to go on board right now to invest into something that is maybe more important in the future?
Yeah, and this is not for everybody. Like, you're gonna keep seeing people telling you, yes, you need PWA for this, you need PWA for that, but it doesn't have to be like that. If you have a small store and you don't have the coding capabilities, that's fine. You don't have to go heads down to this. So this is not for everybody. That's what I wanted to say. So yeah. How about we go with different approaches for doing PWA implementations? There are people who's replacing the front end completely with new storefronts. I've seen implementations like Scandi PWA where they use themes like the traditional Magento theme capabilities. And I really like that a lot because it helps you understand how this is working. What are some of the alternatives you've seen with people doing PWA implementations? We already mentioned PWA Studio, which replaced the entire front end with something like Vinia storefront. And then I've seen Scandi PWA. What about Vue storefront and Didi? Which are the ways they use?
So I've actually seen the same kind of scenarios pop up with all of the different technologies. So one variety would be that you're only implementing PWA-like behavior for the catalog, while all of the other pages are actually still served the old way. And then theoretically, that's by using Vue storefront, and then once the checkout is entered, then you're actually redirecting to that normal checkout in Magento. So there's the benefit basically of allowing for PWA to take over the catalog for performance reasons, while still having like the old school payment methods and shipment providers in the checkout. But funnily enough, the opposite is also true. So you could also just run Vue storefront for only the checkout part, or that's basically also what a lot of people are doing with building their own React checkout, while still using the rest of the site with a traditional front end. So I think it's a little bit independent of what kind of solution you have. Well, it's basically whatever you want to build, you can build. And that's one of the difficulties as well.
But that's really cool. The API coverage is great these days. Like with GraphQL getting bigger and bigger, you can almost do anything. It's not like the API coverage is missing for some of this stuff. And that's great to see because the PWA Studio project is coming along really great. But then there's also the GraphQL implementations, and that's actually improving too, which is important these days.
One thing I'll definitely say that even though it's complicated and it can solve a lot of problems, so a lot of developers and agencies do really need to understand the capabilities, because it is something they can't just sit on the sidelines. They will have to understand the capabilities. Customer would start asking.
Yeah, well, and that's maybe also back to my point that I made in the beginning. So my vision is basically that we're not only talking about PWA, and Magento PWA Studio is not the only provider here. There's also Scandi, Vue storefront, Deity, and etc. But we're actually talking about new alternative front ends altogether, because then we also add in HUFA. And as an agency, I think it would be silly if you're simply saying like, okay, I'm going to implement Magento, and well, all of that other new stuff is experimental, so therefore I'm going to settle for the old stuff. Because there's kind of like a guarantee that with all of those solutions, those new solutions out there, I think the performance will simply be better than the old stuff. So either you settle for the old stuff, which is known maybe, but gives less performance, or you need to make a decision, and that's up to you again, like how you want to make that decision.
And one thing I'll say is it's also very critical for the entire Magento ecosystem to adopt something which can give very fast user experience. Otherwise, it just risks becoming irrelevant. So
yeah. Hey, well, we got a couple of questions actually coming in, and maybe it's nice to also dive into those questions already a little bit. So, for instance, there was this question: what are the biggest challenges when hosting a PWA environment, and what type of hosting is optimal for a PWA environment? So, Miguel, you actually dived into this already a little bit. So, what can you say already about that?
PWA hosting is really hard. We are like, for us, Nexus, we are a traditional PHP hosting company. Basically, what we do is a LAMP, like Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP environment, and that's not always what you need for PWA environments or PWA implementations. If you don't need a middleware, you might be able to build a CSS HTML page and run on GraphQL, but most of the times you will need at least a Node.js, maybe container, maybe service running on a weird port exposed to the internet, and that's kind of hard. If you ask me, we are only supporting implementations that don't require a middleware, that don't require extra software as in a LAMP environment. But it's kind of hard, to be honest. It's not that simple, and more people are trying to use that, and they don't seem to understand you're actually adding another piece, another moving part to the technological stack you are using. So it's not that simple. What do you have to say here?
So it's a bit different for us because we are a custom built platform specifically for Magento, and so there we were able to add capabilities. So think of like when Elasticsearch came in 2.4. So a lot of typical generic shared hosting providers, they were just out of the game. You couldn't consider them. Similarly, here also, what people have to understand is, so if you're implementing PWA through a very simple method, you actually don't need anything different. If you're just compiling the code, building the code and pushing it as static files, then you can use any existing hosting provider. But there also you would need to understand what kind of CI/CD development workflows you have. Because anyways, in the development environment, you would need a Node.js support where you are able to compile. And as you start adding middleware, it's actually two hosting. So Magento is in its own container, and then you have to manage the logging for that container separately. You have to do load testing. You have to understand scaling. You have to have some sort of instrumentation where you are able to figure out if anything breaks, being able to pinpoint that. So that's not really very easy, as specifically when you start doing a more complicated and thorough implementations of PWA. But that is something we're finding interesting, and yeah, I think we are able to do that. So,
And
yeah, go ahead, Vijay. No,
maybe I just wanted to, if there is a pre.
We need PWA for Vijay. We need PWA for Vijay.
You see there, Vijay, you were freeze for a second.
Yeah, so I'm just saying that there may be a chances that some expectation from the smaller agencies now that pre-configured the PWA setup from the hosting provider. So just one click and just basic configurations it comes with, and they can use your basic instructions, and that way they can set up. So that can be maybe a future requirement, can be an emerging requirement according to me.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. So I'm often so it's always difficult to talk about hosting environments without getting into the details. But the PWA is nothing more than a client-side application based upon JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, obviously. And therefore, as soon as that PWA is being converted into only JavaScript, you can simply upload it to a simple hosting environment, and then you're done. It's just that the more complex scenarios, for instance, server-side rendering, they require a different approach. And then, while PWA Studio also has this PHP module available, while it seems like everyone else is actually focused upon a middleware layer upon Node. And the difficulty, I think, is that at first maybe you're going for the cheaper solution. You're going maybe for that PHP-based solution with PWA Studio. But then I always say, like, well, just set it up, but then also set up a Node version, and then simply compare the performance in between. And then the end conclusion is that actually you still need a middleware layer. But it's depending upon what kind of PWA solution you have again. So I think at first the difficulty is always that hosting environment needs to follow a plan. And that plan basically needs to follow that you know about all of the variations by playing around with it, reading about it, while listening to this PWA panel should just be a minimal beginning. Because, well, without understanding the technology, you don't also know what kind of decisions you should make.
One thing I would like to add here is that you really need to understand where, in general and in particular when developing PWA implementations, you need to understand the differences between production servers and like build environments and that kind of stuff. It's always the same. I always say the same, and Arun knows this. You don't want to build your stuff in your production server. You only need to transfer the resulting artifacts in there. If you're asking me to install Node.js in your production server to build your stuff, you're probably wrong. You need to build that stuff someplace else and deploy the artifacts, because this is basically, as Arun said, static files. You don't need to build that in your server. I don't want to maintain Node.js or Yarn in your production server because that's extra software. I need to maintain. Those are newer versions out there. Then there's the Node module folder. It's a complete mess. So don't do that. Simply use a build server, use CI/CD, and deploy the resulting artifacts to your production server. And that's pretty much it. You don't need to install extra software in your server. You don't need to maintain that, and it's way simpler for everybody.
Well, true, but then if you take into account server-side rendering, then it actually becomes a little bit more difficult. And then again, there's multiple solutions for server-side rendering out there, but one of them is basically to run Node on the server anyway. But I think what you're referring to is also the build scripts. So that if you're turning the development scripts into production, don't do that on the production server, but just make sure that you have a local environment to build all of that. But that's maybe also the reality, right? So Magento has grown more complex with microservices, and Arun, you just mentioned also Magento 2.4 is now requiring you to have Elasticsearch. So the microservices are already part of this mechanism of Magento. And I believe also that in the near future, there's going to be more microservices on top of it, depending upon your solutions, depending on your requirements. So in short, yeah, I think the hosting environment is no longer just a single LAMP stack with a little bit of PHP and MySQL. No, we're actually going to see a future where Magento is actually installing multiple microservices on top of each other.
That is definitely going to be the future, because see, any SaaS application or any enterprise product anybody is building today, they would be doing it ground up using microservices. Nobody is sort of going today and building something like a single monolithic for everything. So it's just that we are stuck with the old paradigm, and we'll start adopting it one thing at a time.
Yeah. So it seems that we're slowly running out of time. Miguel, you saw a couple of questions popping up and down. Is there maybe a couple of those that we can still pick up?
Let me check real quick. Yeah, we got the regular questions like React, Vue, or Scandi PWA. Like you said, there's no way for us to tell people, hey, you need to be using Vue Storefront or React. It will really depend on like your needs and your development capabilities. So we'll skip that one. I'll take this one. If anything, what does PWA change for the end user besides speed? This is a great question, and I think we should be talking about not only the end user, but also the developer experience. If you develop for Magento 2, the front end is kind of hard. It's not that simple to implement. But then when you move that stack to a PWA-based implementation, not only you will get, well, more developers willing to work on this, but the development will be way cheaper. So what's your take on this, on the developer experience and on the customer side?
I strongly agree on that, because if you've sort of set up the entire production development to production workflow, and if you are able to separate those teams, you'll be much faster at churning out any new iterations, and eventually it will become a lot cheaper. So
sorry guys to interrupt you. We are running out of time, so we can wind up this here only. And we have so many questions. So guys, if you are having questions and queries, you can connect with on a social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, anywhere. These all are famous guys, so anywhere you can find these guys. So thank you so much for this insightful session. This is right, like since morning I'm hearing PWA, and here like with you guys I heard so many things I forgot about, like to give you heads up about time. I was just involved that in the discussion. So thank you so much for this session.
thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you very much. See ya.
See you.